What's going on, guys? TG or ThunderGod here, and today we are discussing the Sannin versus the 5 Kage. This is an older video of mine, but I kind of wanted to redo it as I have some updated opinions, and maybe if you're curious of how my opinions have changed, go check out this video and then watch this one. I'm not alone today. I figured such a big discussion would require some help, so I brought Cameron with me. Go ahead and say hi.
Yo, I'm splendid to be back on the channel today.
Splendid, he says. And today, like you mentioned, we're talking about the Sannin versus the 5 Kage. To make things interesting, we're actually going to throw the alive old Hiruzen that Orochimaru fights on the 5 Kage side, as obviously we're not going to have a duplicate Tsunade on one side when she exists on the other, to make it fair. With that being said, make sure to check out Cameron if you haven't, and we'll get straight into the discussion. Starting off, there are some interesting statements to look at when discussing the 5 Kage as a group, or just as individuals, as during the 5 Kage summit, it's noted the Kage are the strongest and most influential ninja, which can be chalked up to their respective villages, as we know characters like Pain or Itachi do exist in the verse, or Sage Mode Naruto, who in my opinion is stronger than any of the individual Kage at the 5 Kage summit. So more so leans to the Kage being the strongest in their respective villages. A more relevant statement, in my opinion, is the chapter statement that is promoted when the Kage are ready to face off against Madara, in which they are regarded as the ultimate team. This being relevant if you consider the likes of Naruto and B a team as well at this point in the series, could give the Kage quite a bit of stock, although it's a little up in the air. This is where I would lean into how the Sannin are generally portrayed next to the 5 Kage as a whole. Do you want to touch on this for us?
Yeah, so we do just see in Fan Book 2 that it's noted that the Sannin are reputed to be as powerful as the 5 Kage, which is pretty consistent with how in Part 1, the Sannin are pretty much noted to be unrivaled, as only a Sannin can beat another Sannin, but after the Sannin die, and the 5 Kage are given time to train all the way up to the 5 Kage summit, they kind of just climb back to the Sannin's level, which does support the general idea that they are pretty relative by the time of the 5 Kage summit. And I think you could potentially argue that this is solely referring to the Sannin's base forms, because we do see that Hiruzen, who is another good benchmark for the 5 Kage, is just pretty relative to base Orochimaru during the Chunin exams. I know people like to argue that Hiruzen was mental nerfed, which is valid if you really want to go down that route, but it's often ignored that Orochimaru was also just crying during that fight, and had to stab his own hand before even trying to hurt Hiruzen because of the feelings he had towards his sensei. So even if you want to argue that Hiruzen was mentally nerfed, which is perfectly acceptable, you just have to make the exact same argument for Orochimaru as well, which could support the general idea that the Sannin are relative to the 5 Kage in base, and when they power up into their higher forms, they're just more powerful.
What this does is create a situation to where everybody's within a certain range to where they'll be able to fight one another, and nobody's in that massively power cliffing area to the point that any singular fighter in this fight would be massively dominating the others. It's kind of more of a stylistic discussion where there's a lot more room for nuanced conversation, which is very similar to Tsunade, one of the Sannin, and the other Kage against Madara, all being useful in their own right, and there is a hierarchy there, but they're all able to perform strategies and fight alongside one another against Madara. Starting with the Sannin, I think due to the threat level the 5 Kage possess, the three-way deadlock would make an appearance relatively earlier on. It is noted, especially by Minato, who has seen it before in action, that this is something the Sannin have done in character, meaning it's very well within the realm of possibility that they would do it here. The Sannin summons pretty much adds 3 more characters to the Sannin side. This being relevant if you go off the idea that the Sannin summons are comparable or can fight alongside the Sannin themselves, which is just shown with Jiraiya himself thinking Gamabunto would be even difficult for him. Other statements in the series do support this as well. Kabuto thinking summoning Manda is an extremely risky option for him and Orochimaru, with Manda himself actually believing he could eat and kill Orochimaru. So this line of reasoning does have foundation, even more so with Kabuto, a Kakashi rival, completely cucking down to Manda in this sort of situation. What this does is create a bad circumstance for the 5 Kage off rip, as their number advantage is now dwindled. Segueing back to Hiruzen, this is relevant since he has Enma, which upscales directly from the Sannin summons, being stronger than the Sannin summons. However, it should be noted that Enma fundamentally doesn't operate as autonomously as these summons. He more so operates as a +1 to Hiruzen, entering his stab form, the Adamantine Yoi, meaning it wouldn't be to the same extent to where the Sannin summons are able to, shoot Toad Oil out, or separate such as Katsuyu, or rearrange the battlefield. No, Hiruzen more likely than not is just going to have his staff, which will make him far more formidable as a solo combatant, but won't really be enough to shift the numbers advantage to a noticeable extent back into the Kage's favor. What are your thoughts on Hiruzen and how he fits into this discussion?
Yeah, I will say the statement of Enma being the strongest summon is just really good stock for Hiruzen, because it means that no matter what interpretation you have of the three-way deadlock, Enma would just be stronger, which means that Hiruzen does have a pretty viable method to at least deal with the three-way deadlock and hold them off, since he is just wielding a stronger summon as a weapon. But the real issue with the deadlock and the Sannin in general is that it's not like they're just going to approach one at a time. We see that the Sannin and the deadlock like to use combo attacks with each other and move simultaneously, which is what's really going to give Hiruzen a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and it's not as if the Kage don't have options for the summon, as we have characters like the 4th Raikage who scale to the complete 8 tails or can combat it, such as when we see A4 actually clip the horn off the 8 tails permanently, or particle style from Onoki, which would be very useful against these large summons and would be able to take them out. But you also have to understand these summons probably aren't going to be standing still, which allow these Sannin to operate from a ranged, which granted could also turn in the Kage's favor with the likes of Particle Style or Mei's Water Style, which at the very least should be able to overpower Jiraiya's Fire Style, as it was able to overpower Madara's Kage soloing Fire Style. As Tsunade herself notes, if they don't shut down Madara's Fire Style, they'll have no way of stopping him. As far as her Water Style beating back something like Jiraiya and Gamabunta's combo Fire Release Toad Oil Flame Bullet, it's a bit more nebulous, as this fire style is obviously stronger and larger than Jiraiya's own, the data book noting this and this being pretty self-explanatory. While it is far more likely Madara's fire style exists at a higher magnitude, at least in terms of AP, it's unlikely that Mei would be able to cover the sheer spread of the fire style itself based on how it dwarfs even Gamabunta in size. At the very least, in reference to Mei and her jutsu, I think her lava style is generally a little too slow to tag anybody in this fight. However, her paired with the Raikage is a lethal combo, as when they are attempting to seal Madara, the Raikage actually amps Mei's jutsu with his lightning armor that was so potent that it was actually going to paralyze and immobilize Madara, which is 100% cooking any of the Sannin, and if Mei's water is widespread enough, could have an effect on the summons themselves. So Mei, with her long range versatility, does have a lot of play in this combo.
Even though Mei can arguably beat out the combined fire style of Jiraiya and Gamabunta, I think where Gamabunta actually shines is as a counter to Gaara. We see in the War Arc that when Gaara is fighting Gengetsu, his sand is completely neutralized by Gengetsu's water style, and Gaara specifies that the reason why his sand is so ineffective is because Gengetsu's water is closer to oil in terms of actual substance than regular water. This implies that Gaara's sand in general is weak to oil, and this is particularly relevant because we see that when Gamabunta and Jiraiya do their combo attack, Gamabunta can just spit out a crap ton of oil from his mouth, which makes things pretty bad because if he just starts flooding the battlefield with oil, Gaara may potentially be completely screwed when it comes to using his sand, since it just crumbles apart on its own without anyone even touching it if it's doused in oil-like substances.
Yeah, and that's very pivotal since not only can Gamabunta shoot out this oil, but Jiraiya can on his own as well. Meaning even as an individual, he does have a direct counter to Gaara's sand. This is relevant since none of the Sannin would have the AP or Jutsu potency to break through Gaara's sand defense outside attacks such as Jiraiya's Mountain Carving Rasengan, which is more nebulous, at least in AP scaling directly over Gaara's sand, meaning that this Toad Oil counter is actually very important and allows the Sannin to circumvent breaking through Gaara's defense through raw force. It pretty much is the cheat code by having the exact weakness to Gaara's sand, creating a situation to where Gaara, who is one of the most useful combatants in this discussion, becomes far less relevant if Jiraiya is anywhere near him in proximity, or if he catches any of the Kage in his sand. Jiraiya's Toad Oil or Gamabunto's Toad Oil is very important, as even a little bit can cause Gengetsu to not be sealed by the Grand Sand Mausoleum and appear from the top, despite the fact that most of the structure was able to remain intact. So Gaara in this discussion actually gets hoed drastically, assuming Jiraiya can get off Gamabunta, but even if he doesn't at the lowest interpretation, Jiraiya himself can negate a lot of what Gaara does by disforming his sand.
Although, even though Gaara can be pretty hard countered by the Toad Oil, the Raikage won't be as easy to deal with. The Raikage's bread and butter is really his body flicker, which easily makes him the fastest shinobi on the battlefield. But what I will say is that the Sannin should be able to somewhat keep up with his attacks and evade them, just because when Tsunade and the Raikage confront Naruto and B, pretty much everyone is confident that she should be able to somewhat keep up with those three fighters. Specifically, Tsunade in base form just tells the Raikage to square up, which wouldn't really make sense if he's a blitz tier above her, because she'd literally be sacrificing herself to get destroyed instantly, especially since she didn't even have the 100 healings activated. And the Raikage himself also asked Tsunade for help in a fight to restrain Naruto and B, which just implies that both the Raikage and Tsunade are confident that she can hang with everyone there somewhat, implying that the Sannin just aren't getting blitzed in this situation no matter what, even though the Raikage is clearly faster.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that does set a big precedent since the Raikage is threatening in his use of Shunshin, like you mentioned, in evading a lot of attacks, making him difficult to take down permanently in this fight. Although I will say, this doesn't really operate well unless he can actually get to the Sannin, who, if they are on their summons, he's not really going to be able to by just traveling around the battlefield at high speed. At best, a Lion Raikage should be able to jump to those heights since he was able to hit Madara's ribcage far up into the air, but in terms of regular Raikage, I mean, maybe he runs up Manda's tail like Goku running on Snake Way, you know, maybe he pulls some shenanigans like that. It creates a weird situation to where, like, he's formidable, but what exactly does this do for him in this fight? Since he's not going to be blitzing them outright, it more so just makes him annoying to deal with at best, in my opinion. Furthermore, this also doesn't account for characters like Orochimaru, who has the Edo Tensei. Now, usually I'm kind of stingy with giving characters Edo Tensei, since in character, or since a lot of people don't understand, functionally for the jutsu, you have to have a stockpile of alive bodies, which for characters like Tobirama doesn't really make sense for a Hokage, but someone like Orochimaru, who's scum of the earth, it makes a lot more sense. So I do think it is fair to grant him Edo Tensei in this battle, in which case he at the very least can summon Hashirama and Tobirama, who can compete with the old alive Hiruzen that we mentioned previously that is comparable to the others 5 Kage here. Excluding the 3-way deadlock and the summons themselves, this actually turns the 3v5 into a 5v5. So it completely removes the 5 Kage's number advantage and creates an even matchup, which, factoring back in the 3-way deadlock, now makes it an 8v5. Or if you want to count Enma, an 8v6. As you can see, this creates problems. Now, while I do think the 5 Kage do have ways to deal with the Edo Tensei, such as Gaara's Sand Mausoleum or just basic ceiling tags, or Onoki using weighted boulder into ceiling tags, it just should be noted that what these do is take attention off of the Sannin themselves, which in turn creates more problems. Pretty much dealing with the Edo Tensei, waste stamina and time while the Sannin go and fight another group of Kage. Something to keep in mind, along with the Edo Tensei in question, scaling directly to Hiruzen in their jutsu and ability.
And in addition to the Edo Tensei being able to put more pressure onto the 5 Kage, another way the Sannin can make the numbers advantage even bigger is if Jiraiya decides to summon Ma and Pa. The scene where Jiraiya summons Ma and Pa is a little weirder in the anime because it felt like it took a century, but in the manga it wasn't nearly as long, and Jiraiya can still move while summoning them. People often have the misconception that Jiraiya was charging up Sage Mode during this time, but the only thing he was actually charging up was the chakra to summon Ma and Pa, which means that he can actively move around and essentially use everything but his arms when fighting. We just see this when he creates a sensory barrier by jumping in the air and clicking his feet together. So realistically, the time to summon Ma and Pa isn't as long as people make it out to be, and Jiraiya can actively jump around during this time.
Can I throw a note
which
in
means that him
real
summoning...
quick? I don't want to interrupt you. Something to note real quick, and just in reference to that sensory barrier, is that if you actually look at the screenshot when Mr. Gamakin is knocked away, the sensory barrier expands far outside someone who's comparable to Gamabunta in size. So in a large-scale battle like this, it's actually extremely relevant. It's huge. I'll put it. It's probably on screen, but it's comparable to the giant buildings in the Rain Village. I just want to throw that in since we probably just gonna get scuffed over. But continue. My bad.
Yeah, for sure. So realistically, Jiraiya getting into Sage Mode isn't gonna be nearly as hard as people try to make it out to be, which is particularly important because it's just noted in a weekly statement in Shonen Jump that Jiraiya, in combination with Ma and Pa, are the strongest summoning team, implying that they're stronger than the combination of Hiruzen and Enma. This might seem weird since Enma is referred to as the most powerful summon, but that was only in the first fan book, which includes part 1 content, not anything in Shippuden. So it's actually very concrete for the Elder Toads to just be above Enma and Hiruzen, especially if you go with the alternate translation of the statement, which outright says that it's the battle of the ultimate summons, implying the Rinnegan summons and Ma and Pa are just the strongest summons around, period. Either way, you do get to the conclusion that either Jiraiya is stronger than Hiruzen, or Ma and Pa are stronger than Enma, which means that Jiraiya is just going to be providing more value than Hiruzen in this fight, which is super consistent if you argue that Hiruzen is a combatant on the level of the base Sannin rather than their higher forms. It kinda just helps everything come together in that the Sannin are just much more powerful when they're given the opportunity to actually power up.
Yeah, and I like a lot of what you said, and it's not as if the Kage also don't have ways of amping each other. One of the more popular methods being Onoki and the 4th Raikage's weighted boulder, where Onoki makes the Raikage lighter and heavier when he wants to evade and attack Madara's defense. But I do think it is worth noting that it was actually Onoki who told the Raikage to employ this strategy specifically to get around Madara Susanoo, meaning it may not make an appearance here, and honestly speaking, it doesn't really do too much outside of just making sure the Raikage would absolutely be much faster than characters he's already faster than, and in my opinion, Particle Style is much more useful in a battle where there's larger targets to hit, and Onoki can have free reign just shooting it around as he's going to have multiple opponents to deal with. So keep in mind, Particle Style in this discussion is way more useful than the strategy specifically employed to take down Madara. It doesn't really make sense for the strategy to come about here, but if it does, I think it's useful. Just keep in mind that you're basically losing a fighter on the 5 Kage side, making it an amped 4v8 in certain ways. So, it just sounds kind of crazy. And it's not as if the 5 Kage don't have ways of mitigating a numbers advantage, as Alive Hiruzen can create shadow clones, although it is more so noted that this is a more strenuous activity for him that was actively cutting down his life force. So this wouldn't even be something he could spam to the same extent as his Edo counterpart in the war. I'm not saying he can't make 5 clones, I'm just saying it's not likely he's going to make 5 clones since he's probably not willing to cut his chakra reserves and life force down that much in one go if 2 was such a big issue for him. Which, I mean, in this fight makes a lot of sense, and at best you could maybe say Hiruzen creates a shadow clone to go toe-to-toe with each of the Edo Tensei, which does kind of lean us into one of the win cons for the 5 Kage. But a big point I want to bring up too in this discussion is that the Sannin especially have quite a bit of margin for error, as all 3 have regen in their own right compared to the 5 Kage, which have none. Not a lot of people bring up that Tsunade was actively healing the Kage in the Madara fight, which we'll touch on in a second, but Jiraiya with Sage Mode, would get regen, as it's specifically noted to heal your wounds, and if he doesn't, Tsunade would just heal Jiraiya in base, meaning that is one person she has to heal compared to the 3 Kage she healed in the Madara fight. Orochimaru is a lot more self-explanatory in Oro Rebirth. He doesn't really need to rely on Tsunade's regeneration, so the Sannin as a whole are also a lot harder to put down compared to the Kage, which just don't really have that margin for error. So there's been a lot of discussion, but I think what we really need to do is hammer down what strategies would work for both sides and where we kind of lean on this discussion.
Starting with the 5 Kage's win conditions, I think their main goal in this fight should just be to get the 3 Sannin pinned down, because if they do that, they have a really good chance to take them out. They do have a few avenues to do this. I think the main ones are the weighted boulder jutsu, which were able to hold down Madara's wood clone Susanoo, as well as Gaara's sand, which could temporarily hold down the Edo Kage, but it's worth noting that neither of these solutions are permanent, since the Susanoo just got back up after Onoki dropped them, and the Kage themselves busted out of Gaara's sand. So these aren't concrete win conditions, but if they do manage to restrain the Sannin, I do actually think that Mei could potentially take them out with her lava style, just because it was capable of vaporizing Madara's Susanoo ribcage, which means that it could likely tear through the Sannin as well. So if you do think that either Onoki or Gaara could end up restraining the Sannin for a decent period of time, I do think it would be a pretty good win condition for Mei to just fire her Susanoo destroying lava style into their faces. There's not much they could do about that if they're caught.
Can I throw something in too, just in a second on Mei?
Yep.
Some people might know Mei's feat of covering the entire battlefield in Hidden Mist, and this is actually an extremely impressive feat, but it was only done in order to weaken Madara's visuals due to his visual prowess. It really doesn't serve any purpose in this fight outside just creating a circumstance where none of the Kage could see. And someone like Hiruzen who has experience with this may bode well, but when you get into Jiraiya having sensory and him not needing to see, it starts to work in a disadvantage, especially since this is going to create mass disarray among the Kage as a whole. So just understand that strategy a lot of the Kage strategies were incorporated specifically to counter Madara, more so came about due to Onoki ordering the Kage around.
I think that the 5 Kage's best win condition is probably for Hiruzen to create 2 Shadow Clones and then hit the Sannin with the triple Reaper Death Seal, since we do see that was pretty effective against Edo Hashirama and Tobirama, who are just Hokage class fighters according to the people watching the fight. But the issue with this is that Hiruzen has to grab his opponent physically in order to initiate the Reaper Death Seal, which is pretty difficult because you essentially have to argue that Hiruzen's gonna tag all 3 Sannin while they're on top of their summons simultaneously, which is pretty unlikely since Jiraiya does have precognition due to his Sage Mode, which makes him pretty unlikely to just get grabbed casually like that. And Hiruzen would have to be very careful going in against Tsunade, because if she lands a punch on him and definitely his Shadow Clone is just gonna get destroyed immediately. So I will say that since 2 of the 3 Sannin are much more adept in close combat, it would be a lot harder to do this than it was against Orochimaru in the Chunin exams.
On the Sannin side, the Sannin win conditions are a lot simpler. I'm gonna be honest. The 5 Kage, they have chin tapping win conditions. You just gotta tap your chin with your index finger and think about them. The Sannin, a lot simpler. One of the more basic ones is that they just simply overwhelm the 5 Kage via summons, Edo Tensei, and Ma and Pa, creating a sheer overwhelming numbers advantage, or the Sannin amp themselves on top of this numbers advantage to overwhelm the 5 Kage. That's probably one of the more basic ones, but is one of the most viable. One more underrated one, I guess you could say, is that they outlast the 5 Kage via having better stamina. The reason I say this is that using Tsunade as a metric, who is able to last as long as the Raikage in terms of stamina against the Madara Wood Susanoo clones compared to characters like Gaara or Mei who teetered out first, is that Tsunade was actively giving chakra away during the battle via healing Onoki, Mei, and Gaara. She heals everybody but the Raikage on panel, meaning she actively was using more chakra than other characters during the fight, which is relevant since even in her own words, medical ninjutsu takes a lot of chakra, so this isn't insignificant. Furthermore, among the three Sannin, Jiraiya is most known for his stamina reserves off the 1 Decade 100 Ninja Guide, meaning Jiraiya, even among the Sannin such as Tsunade, is known as somewhat of a stamina juggernaut. This creates a situation to where the Sannin on top of this could just spam more intense jutsu and outlast the 5 Kage. Although I don't think this really speaks for characters like the 4th Raikage, who is somewhat of a stamina juggernaut due to his large scale chakra reserves. I definitely think there is a case for the fight to last long and characters like Mei, Onoki, or Gaara to potentially teeter out, especially considering how Onoki was progressing in the Madara fight and getting various mental amps, or amp singular. The Sannin do have extra win conditions as well, such as in the form of the Frog Song or Gamma Rinsho, the Toad Genjutsu chant that Jiraiya used against Pain. Now, you might say, well, Jiraiya was only really able to catch 3 pats of pain with this Genjutsu, but the databook actually does note, even if the target's numbers are in the hundreds, it makes no difference, meaning the number of Kage present isn't really an issue for Jiraiya. This also isn't factoring in other sly tactics such as Bringer of Darkness, creating more circumstances for the Sannin to get a lucky hit, such as Orochimaru with his Kusanagi blade, which, while not being effective against Gaara or the Raikage, should be effective against Onoki and Mei. It's pretty much the Sannin just have easier win conditions to digest that come about more often than not, rather than creating a harder scenario in the form of the 5 Kage. It just seems the Sannin are more consistent in terms of them coming out on top, whether for their win conditions or for them to elevate themselves further. Like, I mean, we talked about so much and we didn't even touch on 100 healing Tsunade or Orochimaru's Hydra form. While I do think there is a case for the Kage to win, I think the more consistent answer is that the Sannin as a group come out on top. That's the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you did. What do you think down below? Obviously, this is a huge discussion, and it's really hard to encapsulate that in a mere 35-minute video, so let me know what you guys think down below. Obviously, check out Cameron if you like anything we said, and yeah, we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.